we are ready to turn to our fireside chat between David Reingold and David Montgomery. I've already heard a few complaints that we don't actually have a fire up here, so I apologize for that, but please imagine a fire behind us. Let me introduce our participants here. David A. Reingold is the Justin S. Morrill Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Professor of Sociology at Purdue University. David is an extraordinarily innovative dean. I was department head for several years and worked closely with David, and always impressed with the innovation he brought to the job. He started new programs in the College of Liberal Arts, Cornerstone, Degree in 3, others. He's been very successful and innovative at integrating these programs into the liberal arts and into the university. So it's a pleasure to have him with us tonight. Thank you, David, for agreeing to do this. We also have David Montgomery, who directs the Department of Defense's Minerva Research Institute, which is a basic social science research program jointly administered by the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering's Basic Research Office and the Undersecretary of Defense for Policies, Strategy, and Force Development Office. I've also found throughout the day that he has quite the sense of humor, so I have invited him to come back to Purdue anytime to hang out with us here in Boilermaker country. So let me turn it over to you for the fireside chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie, and this is working, it sounds like. Good evening, everyone. We're delighted to be here. It's my pleasure to welcome David Montgomery, Deputy Director of the Minerva Research Initiative, to talk a little bit about his work and his efforts to try and build these bridges between the Defense Department and social scientists. So I guess maybe to begin with, David, can you tell us a little bit about the Minerva Research Initiative? Minerva is the Roman goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, I believe. And so what are the broad objectives of the DoD in partnering with social science researchers and the Minerva Initiative?
So the program was put up in 2008 under then Secretary Gates, who had a feeling that a lot of the relationships with some of the best researchers in the university had atrophied. And so, you know, this is of course all predates my engagement with the program, but the way it's relayed to me is that they set up the program. They wanted to get this set up relatively quickly, and I think they did so in a way that is perhaps not the most efficient way of setting up a program, but it was one that could work at the time. It's divided between two offices in the Department of Defense: the Office of Research and Engineering, which is within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And it's within that, it's in the Office of Basic Research. And then it also has, it also sits within the Office of Policy, Strategy, and Force Development. So ways of sort of disaggregating what those two offices are: the Basic Research Office sort of prides itself in foundational research. There's different funding levels in the Department of Defense which don't exist in national, sort of at NSF and elsewhere, which sort of designates a 6-1, which is basic research funding, as differentiated from things that are more applied. So what they'll often talk about as examples of basic research might be the laser or the internet, things that they had to create certain technologies to, before they actually knew what the use would be. So on the one hand, you have a program that is intended to do social science basic research, but then it's connected with policy, which is concerned with applied research, right? So it's within the within the Office of Policy, Strategy, Force Development. That's the office that was the lead author for the National Defense Strategy. So the ideal is that the Office of Policy will sort of set the problem sets out of which we encourage researchers to do research against, and then we'll help integrate that into the policy decision-making environment. To complicate things a tad further, all of the programs have to be administered through the services. And for me, that was, I had originally thought of the Department of Defense as being this one organization, everyone working together. Sort of like my first faculty meeting, I thought it was going to be about ideas. And it was really about people 30 years of baggage, not liking each other, arguing over things. It's very similar in terms of the Department of Defense. Each of the services have their own agendas, their own sort of priorities. And so on top of the tension between basic research and applied research, you have the services who are also managing the programs but have their own priorities.
So there's a rich history of collaboration between the social sciences and the Defense Department. And I want to ask you just a couple of sort of quick hitting questions about it and sort of get your take on how those evolved. So one of those periods was during the 60s with McNamara and the whiz kids, who were sort of brought in to sort of apply a variety of sort of business practices, and some might say business practices that grew out of the social sciences, to the Defense Department. And you got sort of the introduction of things like benefit cost analysis, thinking about defense appropriations and spending and investment. Was that at all in the foreground or thinking about sort of building off of that legacy, or is that just ancient history that only people like me and a few other older academics are interested in?
I mean, I guess it could be both. I don't know, actually. I wasn't around.
Either was I.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think that there was a genuine feeling of trying to improve relationships with university, because while there have been times when there was a close relationship with university and with social scientists, in particular in the Department of Defense, it's also, there's also times when it's been much more distant. I'm trained as an anthropologist, right? And you don't have too many anthropologists who engage with the Department of Defense. And there's some good reasons for that apprehension. I think one thing that's impressive about it, it's an enormous organization. It's the largest educational institution in the country, largest medical provider. It's the largest of many things. And there are a plurality of programs and plurality of interests. I'm sure some of those are represented in the way you talk about it. In terms of what our program's interested in, it is largely driven by science, and then it's the hope that you can use some of those researchers as ways of giving some feedback in more applied context. So, there were a number of our researchers who influenced how the National Defense Strategy team thought about engaging with proxies, thought about engaging with different near-peer competitors and such.
Another point in time, goes even back further, is a sociologist, I'm a sociologist, from the University of Chicago, Samuel Stouffer, who produced a book called The American Soldier in 1949, after collecting data from about 500,000 American servicemen, mostly at the time, although I think there were some women that were involved in that study, which dramatically sort of influenced how the Defense Department sort of thought about their fighting force. And then you had some proteges of Stouffer. I think some might know the name Charlie Moscos, who's at Northwestern for a long time. He's sort of a protege of that community. But that lineage sort of has I think come to an end, at least in my world. And I guess I'm wondering how are you trying to sort of recalibrate, rebuild that tradition?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the program has undergone a few changes. What I'm hoping that we do is that, and I should maybe back up a little bit. Because of the way the program is set up, there's been some historical tensions with it. Because it's easy enough to keep no one happy when you have people looking for basic research and people looking for applied research. And in the past, there have been people trying to keep both sides happy, which, like I said, resulted in no one being terribly happy. I've worked to try to disaggregate some of that to get people to have different expectations of what would be useful to a applied community. I also think the distance between basic and applied research is slightly different in the social sciences than it is in the natural sciences or the physical sciences. One of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to support projects that are pushing people to do something they wouldn't already be funded to do. Right? Personally, I'm less interested in supporting a political scientist to do what a political scientist would naturally do, or an anthropologist or a sociologist. And in the terms of the way we look at basic research, it's sort of foundational research that could change how future types of questions are approached. So it's methodologically different. It could be high risk. It could fail. But if it works, it could change, like I said, how we look at some of these problems. The ideal is, we support, there's three, I should say maybe three different parts of the program. The main part of the program, which most people are aware of, is the university program, and that's 3-year awards on average of about $1.5 million per team, which is pretty good in the social sciences. And so that's one way in which we're trying to bring in researchers who are going to be able to influence the department in thinking through problem sets that other researchers might also pick up in terms of methodologies and such. We've also paired with U.S. Institute of Peace to do pre-doctoral candidates or to doctoral candidate fellowships for both field research and then also for dissertation write-up. We do, U.S. Institute of Peace has 6 fellows that they give per year. We do 12, 6 field work and 6 dissertation write-up awards. And then we'll just be launching a project, probably a new funding opportunity announcement will go up hopefully within a month on a new project. It's called the Defense Education Civilian University Research Partnership. It's clunky, it's not very ideal. But part of what's behind that is it'll be funding a research PI from a civilian university and from a professional military education institution for 2 years, $200,000 a year. And it will give priority to those who are including professional military education institution students in their research. Right? So part of it is also it's to aim to try and have a pedagogic purpose so that the future military leaders will also have a way of thinking through problems from a social science perspective.
I know in the audience we probably have a number of prospective scholars or scholars who are thinking about applying or have applied. Do you have any tips for them in terms of things that they should be, things that you see in proposals that they should either avoid or emphasize?
Yeah, it's tricky, and I think that historically the program has not done a very good job at making some things clear. Namely the tension that I tried to sort of point out about the program being divided between 2 offices. Most government grants to which people apply, and certainly to which I've applied in the past, ask for policy relevance. And so people will sell the whole proposal towards policy relevance, which is tricky when all of the funding is tied to a funding stream that can't be applied and therefore shouldn't necessarily directly be policy relevant. One way around that challenge is, rather than speaking that you're going to develop a particular tool that could be useful for whatever purpose, talk about it in terms of needing this tool to address a particular theoretical problem or question. By the way, it might be useful for something, but that there's a clear basic research insight as to what the research is going to contribute to the field broadly within social science, and how it might innovate future people future researchers to work in this space. So I think one of the biggest challenges that I find we struggle with, especially with our relationship with the U.S. Institute of Peace, is that contrary to what many people think, the priority in terms of how we evaluate proposals is around the science. That's the scientific merit of the proposal. Whereas U.S. Institute of Peace, for example, is very much concerned with the policy relevance and how it aligns with their research interest. Now, there are other parts of the Department of Defense that are much more concerned with policy. It's much more concerned with applied work and transition research, but not the program I'm involved with.
And what's the reception to Minerva by Congress in terms of its support? There's been, and this as a question that comes from one of our distinguished guests in the audience. There's been a lot of conflict between the NSF and Congress over the social science programs. How has Congress and the appropriators sort of interacted and viewed the Minerva effort?
So, I mean, Congress is probably our biggest supporter. We just received a small congressional plus-up in our budget. And I think that there's a general concern or general thought that there needs to be more investment in social science. It's not entirely clear for a lot of people what that means. I can't speak to Congress's relationship with NSF, but I know at least on our part we've tried to. I've made efforts to improve our relations with NSF and have them on our reviews and such. There's one way in which I try to, this may be artificial, but the way in which I try to think about how our program differs from an NSF program is that really DoD is concerned with a particular problem set, which I think bodes well for interdisciplinary work, and that you're trying to address a particular problem, that you need different methodologies, different approaches. We were talking a little bit around earlier, talking about epistemological questions, epistemological differences. I actually think there's ontological differences that we don't talk much about. But in interdisciplinary work, you don't necessarily have to resolve all of those different ontologies. But to address a particular problem, you have to have them present. So I think, at least the way I often talk about it, is that we have a much more constrained problem set than NSF does. But in terms of the value of the science and the quality of the science, I hope it's on par.
So I can't help but ask this question. I noticed that NSF, and I know you don't speak for NSF, but I'm curious as a collaborator, I noticed they're proposing to change the names of most of their social science programs. Have you noticed this or no?
Yeah, I meof
I was going to ask you if you had any sort of thoughts on whether or not that might actually sort of work. And some of them actually, the renaming sort of brings it closer, I think, to some of the efforts that Minerva has.
No, I feel like we have a pretty close relationship, so it's hard to say much about. With the people at NSF, I have a pretty good relationship, but what's happening, what's behind the name changes, such I don't know much about.
Oh, that's all right. And now, on sort of the sort of where you see Minerva moving forward, I'm mindful that it wasn't that long ago that, for example, when we were in the rebuilding stages of Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a lot of concern, let's say, in the Defense Department about how are you actually going to reconstitute their economies? How are you going to actually sort of build governments? Those were sort of the basic questions that they had, that they were trying to grapple with. And are those still in the minds of our Defense Department colleagues, or is that sort of ancient history and now we're thinking about very different questions?
I think it depends on where you sit within the department. Certainly the National Defense Strategy indicated a shift in priorities across the department from an emphasis on sort of terrorism and such towards more great power competition, peer and near-peer competition. People have talked a lot about China, Russia, but Iran and such. And you do have a noticeable shift in how people talk about that within the department. And also, you'll even notice that in the topics that we have this year as opposed to what we had a few years past. But there's a challenge, I think, within basic research as a whole. Probably the most successful, communicating with leadership in the Department of Defense is usually through PowerPoint, which as an academic, I've always resisted and never try to use it. But there was one slide that what we did was we looked at the investment in 2008 within basic research. And the Basic Research Office within the Office of Secretary of Defense has oversight of about $1.2 billion. Social science has a fraction of that, but I'm working on it. And if you look at what those priorities were in 2008 and what we were funding, we probably aligned in basic research about 40% with what those priorities were. That 60% on which we didn't align, 10 years later, our priorities now. So part of it is trying to articulate to leadership that basic research should, in some ways, align with the priorities, but also it's okay if it doesn't, because it should be pushing us a bit further to what might some of the future issues be. So it's sort of a balance between the two.
So I'm mindful of time.
I'm here till Saturday.
You're very generous. We will not keep you until Saturday.
I think it was nervous laughter.
Edward Shills, who was one of the founders of the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, once sort of in writing about the relationship between the science and the authority of the state, sort of said that all science can either be can take one of three positions relative to the authority of the state. It can either legitimate the authority of the state, it can challenge the authority of the state, or it can be independent of the authority of the state. And I guess in terms of how you think about the projects you're funding and how those projects relate to the authority of the state, do you sort of try and operate in one of those spaces, or is that just too much of a sort of esoteric question?
Personally?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's a little easier. I mean, I think there are projects, and we were talking a little bit about, people were talking about Project Maven earlier as one that's difficult for some people to engage with, to feel comfortable engaging with the Department of Defense on. And as I mentioned, a lot of my colleagues in anthropology have challenges with the Department of Defense. I mean, in some ways, this program is easy for me because it's basic research, it's unclassified. I can talk about everything that we're doing. So it actually is a pretty easy way in which a researcher could engage with the department. And if the department was a bit more nimble in sort of telling its own story, there would be a lot more conversation about the program and what it does. I bring that up because the researchers, once they're awarded, they can do whatever they want, right? We have no say over what's published, how they talk about it, and they have all sorts of flexibility. I was with some researchers who were talking about proxies, doing their annual presentation, progress. And what struck me was that they were the obvious problem that they were getting at, but they were skirting around, was that one of the problems with proxies is when the U.S. doesn't keep its bargain on things, right? And they said, well, we don't think you guys want to hear those things. It's like, well, Oh, it's research, right? I mean, so this should be a really straightforward thing. I mean, but okay, say you don't want to call the U.S. out. You can talk about the way in which other allies have these same types of challenges. They present their same types of challenges. So I think that, at least in my experience, the researchers shouldn't feel limited. They certainly should feel free to challenge the state in this context.
Now, one question I maybe should have started with, but maybe we'll sort of bookend with, is who is in the social sciences?
You mean who counts as social science?
Yeah, who counts as social sciences? I mean, so for example,
I was afraid I was going to have to list all these people's names.
No. But I mean, just in
a
terms
lot of people.
No. But in terms of the bucket, so for example, if you the discipline of economics, I think I don't know if I mean, a lot of my co-authors who are economists, I'm not sure that they would call themselves social scientists.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I'd
for
like
example,
to say only anthropologists are social scientists. Nobody else matters.
Or for example, and if you were to look, let's say at the work that Nash did in terms of the Nash equilibrium and sort of how that sort of sketched out the entire sort of world of game theory, that is sort of the underpinnings of a lot of sort of basic thinking around national security policy. I mean, there's sort of deep connections with economics, and certainly certain branches of economics and the Defense Department. There used to be these really deep connections in sociology that I think is sort of are no longer there. But I'm not. But again, it's sort of a question of sort of who counts as a social scientist. The psychologists, for example, I'm not sure the psychologists now they'll call themselves behavioral scientists. Right?
Yeah, there will be some psychologists who do call themselves social scientists, and it depends on the definition that we use. I mean, you can look in disciplinary, you'll see people, anthropology, sociology, psychology, economics. I'm on the spot, so I'm sure I've forgotten some, but in many ways, I'm a heterodox. I don't care about these distinctions. What I'm more concerned about, and so the way the program defines it is it doesn't, right? It keeps it broad, and you can kind of tell when it's not social science, right? I mean, you do have a lot of people who might be doing computer programming and working on data sets, large data, and they present themselves as social science. I have a problem with that because I do think you have to engage with a particular, you have to have a concerted focus on engaging with questions of sociality. And I think that, it could be that, a quantum physicist could help us understand group dynamics better than what we have now, right? It may not be linear. So it may be that we need to be more creative, but I would be less comfortable thinking that a physicist could do that by him or herself without having a social scientist within the group. So in terms of how we look at the projects, I try to encourage people to be more creative. The boundaries of things they're always squishy. Boundaries divide, but they also connect, right? So we need to think about different ways in which we can play with these types of things, and try to bring different people in. That's one reason why I think, looking at it as a problem set within DoD is right for doing interdisciplinary work, because then you have to have a different language, and you have to sort of approach it in different ways, ideally with a bit of epistemological humility about your own discipline's, monopoly on the truth.
So you're not funding economists.
We are skeptically funding some.
I couldn't help myself.
Yeah,
I'm very fond of our economics colleagues.
No, everyone should have one.
That's good. Please join me in thanking David for his time with us.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Okay, we've got time for a couple of questions. I'm going to kick one off if it's okay. So David, of the topics that you heard today and the different ideas that were bandied about, was there something that struck you as, somebody should put in a Minerva application to do research on this topic?
Well, I actually had no idea what you're going to ask me about. So this is my talk. No, I'm just kidding. So there is an open funding opportunity announcement. And there's 9 topics. I'll read them because it'll take you a while to go to the website. It's peer and near-peer statecraft, influence, and regional balance of power. Power, deterrence, and escalation management. Alliances and burden sharing. Economic interdependence and security. Economic viability, resilience, and sustainability of logistics infrastructure. Multi-domain behavioral complexity and computational social modeling. Autonomy, artificial intelligence, machine ethics, and social interactions. That one might fit.
Might fit.
Models and methods of understanding covert online influence and automated cyber vulnerability analysis. So those are the 9 sort of topic problem sets that are currently open.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Comment? Thomas?
So a couple of months ago, the National Academies published a decadal study on the role of the social and behavioral sciences in national security and intelligence.
Correct.
Could you comment on that? Are there findings in that study that are informing the Minerva project, or things that you think the community should be thinking about that came out of that?
So I'm smiling because we're actually finishing up a National Academy study ourselves,
Okay.
Which we deliberately did not align with the decadal study.
Decadal study.
Because one of the tensions, of course, is the default is to see Minerva, or to sort of conflate it into intelligence, which it's not. When people don't know something, they fill in the gaps with their own assumptions about something. Our study by the National Academies is to try and look at the effectiveness of the program and if it's run in the right way, which I'm sure it's not. But hopefully that will give us the leadership, give leadership the guidance. I do think that the challenges that come out in the decadal study are relevant, because part of it is how do you engage with government more broadly. I've been terribly impressed with the people that I work with. I think they work hard, they're smart, they're well-intentioned. Sometimes we see the world slightly differently. I think that that's the case whether it's working with the intelligence agencies, State Department, USAID, any of the agencies, CHS. Part of what comes out in the decadal study is an effort to try to engage with people. So it doesn't really answer your question, but I guess that was my prerogative, right?
So I apologize, you probably get this question a lot, but I'm really curious about your reflections on the replication crisis, because that's hit the social sciences pretty hard. And from your perspective, from basic research, what type of formalisms do you like people to incorporate? And the message that we get from, like, say, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research is, evidence-based, practice-based. There's different mathematics for different situations, and so. But I'd love your perspective on how the replication crisis is affecting your discipline.
Replication. I thought you said reputation. I was trying to think of what was wrong with the reputation.
You might want to give people an idea of what we're talking about.
Or not. No, so the question was about the replication crisis. I mean, one of the challenges in much of the service offices within Department of Defense, and I should perhaps add that the Office of Naval Research was set up before the National Science Foundation, right? So there has been a strong commitment to scientific research, but I should sort of give the frame of that as much of the leadership in research as physicists and engineers. So The replication crisis then is that how do you know what you're saying in social science actually is a real thing? The way we know is because we'll do an experiment and we'll replicate it and it will prove that we were right. That actually has been one of the biggest challenges that I didn't expect to have to face because I accept social science as being a legitimate thing. There's a DARPA program that's trying to sort of move toward sharing data early to try to sort of address the issue of sort of fuzzy data, whether or not it can be replicated and such. Within my program, we don't deal with it too much. As a qualitative methodologist, I'm skeptical of being able to, to replicate some of the work that I've done in the field as an anthropologist. So some of that is trying to make clear that, again, if we go back to different ontologies, it is different information. It doesn't have, how do you get people to see that it doesn't have, it can still be scientific, but doesn't have to look like engineering or physics, right? I mean, I don't remember the quote exactly, but Feynman was quoted as sort of saying something to the effect of, just imagine how difficult, physics would be if electrons had emotions, right? But those are the challenges that we face. I think one of the biggest challenges, at least in terms of my own work, is how do you theorize movement? Because we live with a great deal of cognitive dissonance, but yet we don't tell stories in that way, and we actually don't often credit others for having these sort of same types of challenges. I suspect most of us in this room could give a narrative of how we ended up where we were, or where we are, and it will sound relatively linear, but of course, if we're honest about it, it had, other opportunities that, it's much messier. That problem of complexity is one that I think is really important. Yeah.
Okay, so something you alluded to a couple of times in your conversation here, and I think also Director Coates alluded to in his discussion, is that there's a lot of social scientists, but also scientists in general, that are wary of engaging with the Department of Defense.
Sure.
And that maybe doesn't apply to people in this room because we're in this room.
Or it does. I mean, they fed you, right? So there was incentive for you to come here.
So what is your pitch for why people should engage with the Department of Defense?
So I've talked to a few people about this on the side. So my background is as an anthropologist, and I was pretty critical of defense. One of the projects that I was working on was around religion and security, what constitutes security. And my framing as a researcher, and here I'm talking as a researcher, is security is largely rooted within well-being, what constitutes a good, secure life. What was true is that you were having a number of Central Asians who were joining ISIS. And that creates a particular way of addressing a problem. Usually the problem gets characterized as around Islamic extremism, radicalism, what have you. All of that sort of confuses me a little bit because to live a religious life is actually a really radical way of living a life. But we're messy with those types of terms. If you actually look at the Central Asians who were joining ISIS, they were all joining ISIS in Russia, where they were working as migrant laborers. They weren't integrated, they were disaffected largely. And they weren't going back to Central Asia. So many of them were either killed or they were returning elsewhere. And that's a very different type of problem. So one question would be, why is it that you have, in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, for example, are the most remittance-dependent countries in the world. I mean, I don't know what it is now, but it was like 1 and 2, 1 and 3. The problem isn't Islamic terrorism or radicalism. It's people don't have jobs and they have to leave and all these other things. And what are the long-term implications when you have a village where there's no men? So I was critical of this. I took a policy fellowship through the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They offered me a position at the Department of Defense. I wanted to say no. It scared me. I resisted for a long time. But then I talked with colleagues who, and I was convinced that it would be the most difficult one for me to take. I can't speak for other people, but at least for me, like I said, I've been impressed with the people that I've been around. It's easy to say that people are stupid or that they're ignorant, or to discount them in one way or the other. A lot of my own research interest is in applied anthropology, applied research. And it's a very different environment as an academic as opposed to the environments in which many people have to make decisions with incomplete knowledge. So if you want them to make better decisions, then I do think you have an obligation, at least as a pedagogue, to somehow educate a bit. So you can choose what you engage with. This, for me, was easy for part of the reasons that I gave before. But I respect those who pick and choose what they're comfortable with. There are projects which I would also be less comfortable with. But I do think there are ways in engaging that don't create moral crises for those who are pacifist or whatever your orientation may be. But I won't judge you one way or the other. But I do think that's at least my approach.
Okay, thank you so much, David Reingold, for leading the conversation, and David Montgomery, thank you for your thoughtful remarks. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me hand it over to Tomas. Okay. Well, thank you all. It's been a fabulous day, and on behalf of PPRI and Discovery Park and Purdue University, we've been thrilled to have you here with us. It's been an amazing opportunity. We'll have the live stream and the video up on our website soon, and I hope you will refer people to it, and we really appreciate your being with us. So thank you.